The rope is tightening. That is the first thing you need to understand. Before the fire, before the ships, before the songs of glory, there is the rope. It is not being held by a warrior. It is being held by two men who are pulling from opposite ends, their muscles straining, their faces blank. And between them, struggling for air, her eyes wide with a terror that transcends language, is a young girl. She is not an enemy combatant. She is not a criminal. She is a sacrifice. And standing over her, watching the life drain from her eyes with the cold detachment of a butcher, is an old woman. The Vikings call this woman the Angel of Death, and she is holding a dagger. We like to believe we understand the Vikings. We have turned them into pop culture icons. We see them as rugged adventurers, misunderstood explorers who fought for family and honor. We buy video games where we play as the hero, swinging an axe for glory. We watch TV shows where the violence is stylized, choreographed, and ultimately justifiable. We have sanitized the Northmen. We have stripped away the rot and the blood until they became palatable for our modern sensibilities. But history is not a television show. It does not care about your comfort. It is found in the dark corners that the sagas tried to hide. It is found in the silence of the bog, where bodies lie preserved for centuries with nooses still around their necks. It is found in the ash of the funeral pyres, and it is found in the ink of travel journals written by men who did not see heroes when they looked at the Vikings. They saw monsters. Tonight, we are going to burn the myth. We are going to step off the map of the civilized world and journey into the heart of religious madness. We are not here to look at the brilliance of their navigation or the beauty of their art. We are here to look at the price of their belief. We are going to reconstruct, minute by minute, the rituals that defined the spiritual reality of the Viking Age rituals that required human blood to grease the wheels of the universe. We will stand on the frozen banks of the Volga River and watch as a slave girl is drugged, abused, and murdered for a master she did not choose. We will walk through the sacred groves of Uppsala, where the trees hang heavy with the rotting corpses of men and dogs. And we will dissect the anatomy of the blood eagle to ask the final, terrifying question: was it real? This is not a story for the faint of heart. This is a descent into the dark. To understand the full horror of what happened on the Volga River in the year 921 AD, we must first understand the eyes that saw it. This account does not come from a Norse poet trying to flatter a king. The Vikings did not write down their own crimes. They sang of glory, not of the grim, messy details of butchery. The truth comes from an outsider, a man who was as far removed from the mud and blood of the Viking world as it was possible to be. His name was Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He was not a soldier. He was not an adventurer seeking fortune. He was a scholar, a theologian, and a diplomat from the city of Baghdad. In the 10th century, while Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages, Baghdad was the center of the universe. It was a city of marble palaces, of vast libraries filled with the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, of running water, astronomy, and refined poetry. Ibn Fadlan was a man of logic, a man of strict religious hygiene, and a man of the book. He represented the peak of civilization. In June of 921, he was sent on a perilous mission by the Caliph to the king of the Volga Bulgars, a tribe living deep in what is today modern Russia. The journey was a nightmare that would have broken a lesser man. He traveled over 3,000 miles, leaving the warmth of the desert for the biting alien cold of the steppes. He faced bandits who would kill for a pair of boots. He faced freezing winds that cut through bone. As he traveled further north, he felt as if he were walking off the edge of the earth. The days grew strangely, impossibly long. The nights became short, twilight-filled grays where the sun refused to truly set. The people he met became wilder, less refined, more dangerous. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the people he met when he finally reached the river. He had heard rumors of them. The locals whispered about the Russ. They were Swedish Vikings, traders and raiders who had dragged their longships across the Russian river systems to sell furs, amber, and slaves to the rich markets of the East. They were the apex predators of the trade. Ibn Fadlan's first encounter with the Russ was a shock to his entire nervous system. He was used to the modest, covered dress of the Islamic world, where skin was private. The Russ walked nearly naked, or covered only in cloaks that left one arm free for violence. He wrote in his journal with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Physically, he had never seen such specimens. He wrote, "I have never seen more perfect physical specimens. They are as tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy. They were giants compared to the men of Baghdad. They were carved from muscle and scar tissue, fed on a high-protein diet of meat and mead. But it wasn't just their size that struck him. It was their skin." Ibn Fadlan noted that every single man was tattooed from the tips of his fingers to his neck. He described the tattoos as dark green figures, trees, and symbols, a tapestry of ink that marked their clan, their kills, and their devotion to gods that Ibn Fadlan considered demons. They were beautiful in the way a tiger is beautiful. But as he stepped closer to their camp, the image of the noble savage shattered instantly. The smell hit him first. It was a physical wall of odor, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, animal skins, and stale alcohol. These men did not live by the laws of civilization. They lived by the law of the axe. Every man, Ibn Fadlan noted, carried an axe, a sword, and a knife at all times. They never put them down. They ate with them. They slept with them. The swords were broad, flat, and grooved Frankish blades that were razor-sharp and worth a fortune. Ibn Fadlan set up his tent on the periphery of their camp, watching them like a biologist watching a pack of wolves. He was fascinated by them, but he was also deeply afraid. He realized very quickly that for the Russ, life was cheap. They were merchants, yes, but their merchandise was human beings. They had traveled south not just with furs, but with captured slavesmen and women taken from the Slavic villages they had burned. He watched as they treated these slaves not as humans, but as cattle. He saw them praying to wooden idol stall poles with hideous faces carved into them, masking for better prices for their captives. He saw a society where empathy did not exist, where power was the only currency, and where death was just another part of the transaction. He thought he had seen the depths of their barbarism. He thought he understood what they were capable of. But he was wrong. He had only seen them living. He had not yet seen how they died. And soon, a wail would go up from the camp, signaling the death of a great chieftain and the beginning of a ritual that would stain Ibn Fadlan's memory forever. The angel of death was preparing her tools. To understand why a human sacrifice could happen so openly, without anyone stopping it, we must first look at the society that demanded it. Ibn Fadlan spent months observing these men, the Russ, and his writings give us the most intimate, unvarnished portrait of Vikings ever recorded. He was simultaneously mesmerized and horrified by them. To the refined scholar from Baghdad, accustomed to daily prayers, public baths, and the strict modesty of Islamic culture, the Vikings were like aliens crashing into his world. He described their bodies with a mix of fear and admiration. He wrote that he had never seen men so physically perfect. They were tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy-skinned. But their skin was not just skin. It was a canvas. He noted that from the tips of their toes to their necks, they were covered in dark green line tattoos depicting trees, figures, and symbols. This wasn't just decoration. In a world without uniforms, these markings told a story of clan, of kills, and of devotion to gods that Ibn Fadlan considered demons. But it was their relationship with violence that truly unsettled him. He noted that no Rus Viking ever went anywhere without his weapons. Even when sleeping, even when eating, they kept an axe, a sword, and a long knife within arm's reach. The sword blades were broad, flat, and grooved likely the high-quality Frankish steel that was worth a fortune in the north. These were men living in a permanent state of high alert, where a disagreement over a trade deal could end in a decapitation within seconds. Then there was the Hygiene. This part of Ibn Fadlan's manuscript is famous for a reason. He watched their morning ritual with absolute revulsion. Every day, a servant girl would bring a large brass bowl of water to the master. He would wash his face, rinse his hair, and comb it into the water. Then he would blow his nose and spit into the bowl. Instead of changing the water, the girl would carry that same bowl filled with mucus and filth to the next man, who would do the exact same thing. By the time it reached the end of the line, the water was a toxic sludge of bodily fluids. To the Vikings, this was a communal bond, a sharing of essence. To Ibn Fadlan, it was the filthiest behavior of God's creatures. This lack of boundaries extended to everything. He watched them have sex with their female slaves in public, often in full view of their trading partners. It was a display of dominance, a way of showing that they owned these women completely, body, soul, and life. The slaves, the thralls, were not people to them. They were cattle, and, just like cattle, they could be slaughtered for a feast. This dehumanization is the key. You cannot understand the Angel of Death ritual if you think of the victim as a person. To the Vikings, the slave girl who was about to die was simply another piece of property, like the jewelry or the food being placed in the grave. She was an object to be used for the chieftain's comfort in the next world. And the most terrifying part, she agreed to it. Asterisk, asterisk, the atmosphere in the camp changed the moment the chieftain died. The noise of trade stopped. The drinking songs were replaced by the sounds of construction. The Rus did not bury their dead immediately. For a poor man, they would build a small boat and burn it. But this was a great leader. His funeral required 10 days of preparation. They took his body and placed it in a temporary grave, a cold cellar dug into the earth, and covered it with a roof of dirt. They left him there with intoxicating drinks and fruits, leaving the body to stiffen in the cold ground while they prepared his true vessel, his longship. The ship was hauled out of the water and propped up on 4 massive wooden posts. It was no longer a vehicle for the river. It was now a vehicle for the sky. They began to dress the stage. They walked back and forth, loading the deck with heavy brocades, cushions of gold, silk, and furs. They were creating a throne room on the deck. Then came the question that haunts the entire narrative. A crier went among the chieftains, slaves, men and women alike, and asked a simple, terrifying question: who will die with him? Silence hung over the group. To volunteer was irrevocable. Once the words were spoken, there was no taking them back. The sagas tell us that usually a female slave would volunteer. Why? We can only speculate. Perhaps she believed it was her only ticket to a glorious afterlife, escaping the misery of slavery. Perhaps she was pressured by the other slaves. Or perhaps she was drugged and indoctrinated to believe she was the chosen one. In this case, a young girl stepped forward. She said, "I will." From that moment on, she was no longer a slave. She was treated like a princess. 2 other slave girls were assigned to her, not to guard her, but to serve her. They washed her feet. They fed her the best food. They adjusted her clothes. But there was a darker purpose to this service. They were there to ensure she didn't change her mind. She was watched 24 hours a day. She spent the next 10 days singing, drinking, and laughing. Ibn Fadlan described her as joyful, but modern psychologists might call it dissociation. She was likely kept in a state of permanent intoxication, drifting in a haze of alcohol and religious ecstasy, unable to fully grasp the horror that was waiting for her on the ship. And overseeing all of this, the clothes, the ship, the girl was a woman. Ibn Fadlan asked who she was. The Rus called her the Angel of Death. We tend to imagine a mythical spirit, a ghost, but Ibn Fadlan was very specific. The Angel of Death was a real person. She was an old woman. He described her as thick-set, dark, and grim. She was a priestess, a Volva of the highest order. She was not a passive observer. She was the executioner. It was her job to sew the funeral clothes. It was her job to prepare the bed on the ship. And, when the time came, it would be her job to drive the dagger into the girl's ribs. The 10 days passed. The temporary grave was opened. The chieftain's body, now dark and cold, was lifted out. The stage was set. The fire was waiting. And the Angel of Death picked up her knife. Asterisk, asterisk. The 10 days of drinking and waiting were over. As the sun began to dip on the final afternoon, the camp transformed into a theater of blood. The time for singing was finished. Now, the physics of the afterlife took over. The Rus believed that the next world was a physical place, a destination that required supplies, transportation, and companionship. They were not sending a ghost to the other side. They were sending a household. They went to the temporary grave, the cold cellar where the chieftain had been rotting for a week and a half. They scraped away the earth and pulled him out. Ibn Fadlan notes that the body had turned black from the cold, but it had not decayed. They stripped him of his grave clothes and dressed him in new garments, trousers, leggings, boots, a tunic of gold brocade, and a cap of sable fur. They propped him up on the ship, seated on the quilt-covered throne, propped up with pillows so he looked like a king holding court. Around him, they placed the tools of his trade, fruits, bread, meat, and jars of Nabida potent fermented drink. They laid his weapons by his side. He was ready, but he was alone. Then began the slaughter of the menagerie. This was not done quickly. It was a spectacle intended to prove the wealth of the dead man. First, they brought a dog, the guardian of the home. A warrior took a knife, sliced the animal in two, and threw the pieces into the ship. Next, they brought 2 horses. These were not old, sick animals. They were prime stallions. They made them run until they were sweating, building up the energy of life, and then, while the animals were panting and alive with adrenaline, men hacked them to pieces with swords, throwing the bloody meat onto the deck. Next came 2 cows, then a rooster and a hen. By the time they were finished, the deck of the ship was slippery with gore. The air was thick with the copper smell of blood, and the flies were already gathering. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a floating abattoir. While the animals were dying, the girl was preparing for her own departure. She moved between the tents of the chieftain's kinsmen. This part of the ritual is perhaps the most difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. She entered the tent of each important man. The man would have intercourse with her. But this was not an act of lust, or at least, not only of lust. It was a ritual transaction. As he finished, the man would say to her in a loud voice, "Tell your master that I have done this out of love and friendship for him." They believed they were transferring their life force, their loyalty and their affection into her body, so she could carry it to the dead chieftain. She was becoming a vessel. She was collecting the essence of the clan to take with her. As the sun touched the horizon, the final phase began. The angel of death appeared. The girl was led to a strange wooden frame that looked like a door frame standing in the middle of the field. 3 times, the men lifted her up by her feet so she could see over the top of the frame. This was the doorway to Valhalla. She was entering a trance. The first time they lifted her, she said, "Behold, I see my father and my mother." The second time, she said, "I see all my dead relatives seated." The third time, she screamed, "I see my master seated in paradise, and paradise is beautiful and green. With him are men and boy servants. He calls me, so let me go to him." She was no longer on the banks of the Volga. In her mind, the drugs and the hysteria had opened the veil. She handed a chicken to the angel of death, who cut off its head and threw it into the ship. This was the first blood she had spilled. It was the signal. They led her onto the ship. She took off her bracelets and gave them to the old woman. She took off her anklets and gave them to the 2 servant girls who had washed her feet. She was stripping away her earthly possessions. Then she was given a cup of nabi. She took it, sang a long, mournful song, and drank. The interpreter whispered to Ibn Fadlan, "She is taking leave of her friends." She was given a second cup. She took it and sang again. But this time, the song went on too long. She hesitated. The alcohol was wearing off, or perhaps the adrenaline was cutting through the haze. The reality of the knife was suddenly very close. The angel of death did not have patience for hesitation. She grabbed the girl's head and shoved her into the tent that had been erected on the deck, the tent where the dead chieftain sat. 6 men entered the tent with her. The flap closed. Outside, the warriors began to beat their wooden shields with sticks. Thump, thump. Ibn Fadlan asked why. The interpreter explained, "So that the other slave girls will not hear her screams and become afraid of volunteering for death in the future." The noise was deafening. It was a wall of sound designed to hide the atrocity happening inside the tent. Inside, the 6 men held her down. They laid her beside her dead master. They held her hands and her feet. The angel of death entered. She looped a cord round the girl's neck and gave the ends to 2 of the men to pull. It was a dual execution. As the men pulled the rope, strangling the breath from her throat, the angel of death stepped forward with a broad-bladed dagger. She drove it between the girl's ribs, once, twice. The shielding beating outside grew louder. Inside, the struggle ceased. The girl was gone. She had become an object, just like the horses, just like the gold. The angel of death stepped out of the tent, her hands stained red. The men came out. The ritual of life was over. The ritual of fire was about to begin. The closest relative of the dead man grabbed a torch. He walked backward toward the ship, naked, holding the fire behind him, refusing to look at the pyre until the wood caught. He shouted a prayer, and then the fire was thrown. Within an hour, the ship, the treasures, the horses, the dead king, and the murdered girl were nothing but ash blowing across the Russian steppes. Ibn Fadlan stood there, shaking. He had witnessed the ultimate expression of Viking faith. A faith that did not see death as a tragedy, but as a necessary, violent transfer of energy. But while Ibn Fadlan's account is the most detailed, it is not the only evidence we have. If you think the Volga was a nightmare, wait until you see the trees of Sweden. Because in the sacred grove of Uppsala, they didn't burn their victims. They hung them. We leave the ashes of the burning ship on the Russian steppes and travel west. Across the Baltic Sea, deep into the heart of Sweden, lies a place that was the spiritual Rome of the Viking world. It was called Uppsala. If the Volga funeral was a private family tragedy, Uppsala was a national spectacle. It was a cathedral of blood. Our guide to this nightmare is a German monk named Adam of Bremen. Writing in the late 11th century, Adam collected reports from travelers and Christian converts who had visited the temple. His writing drips with a mixture of fascination and holy terror. He describes a temple covered in gold. He writes of a golden chain that hung from the roof and wrapped around the entire building, glittering in the sun, blinding those who approached from the valley. Inside this golden shell stood 3 massive statues. In the center was Thor, the mightiest, holding a scepter. To his side was Wadnodin, the god of war, clad in armor. And on the other side was Frigga, god of pleasure and fertility, depicted with an immense phallus. It was here, every 9 years, that the entire nation gathered. It did not matter if you were a king or a peasant. Attendance was mandatory. If you were a Christian and refused to come, you had to pay a heavy fine to buy your exemption. But most came willingly. They came for the blot. The word blot means sacrifice. It means to strengthen. The Vikings believed that the gods were not infinite sources of power. They needed to be fed. They needed energy to keep the sun rising, to keep the crops growing, and to keep the chaos of the giants at bay. And the most potent fuel in the universe was blood. The ritual at Uppsala lasted for 9 days. The number 9 was sacred in Norse mythology. 9 worlds on the world tree. 9 nights Odin hung on the Yggdrasil, and so the math of the slaughter was precise. Adam of Bremen writes that on each of the 9 days, they offered up a sacrifice. But this was not just a goat or a sheep. The law of the blot required 9 males of every living species, 9 hawks, 9 dogs, 9 stallions, and ... 9 men. These men were not enemies captured in battle. They were not criminals. In many cases, they were chosen from the community. To be sacrificed at Uppsala was, in a twisted way, an honor. It was the ultimate service to the tribe. Or perhaps, like the girl on the Volga, they were slaves who had no choice in the matter. But it wasn't the killing itself that horrified the Christian observers. It was what they did with the bodies afterwards. They did not burn them. They did not bury them. They displayed them. Behind the golden temple lay a forest. This was the sacred grove. Adam writes that this grove was considered so holy that every single tree and every single leaf was believed to be divine, purely because it had absorbed the smell of death. They took the bodies of the victims, the dogs, the horses, and the men, and They dragged them into the trees. They tied ropes around their necks, and they hung them. Imagine walking into that forest. It is winter. The air is freezing. The wind is howling through the branches, and hanging above you, swinging slowly in the breeze, are 72 corpses. But it is the arrangement that turns the stomach. They did not separate the humans from the animals. Adam writes, "I have seen the bodies of dogs and men hanging together. A dead warrior swinging next to a dead horse. A human swaying beside a hound." To the Christian mind, this was the ultimate blasphemy. It reduced man, made in God's image, to the level of a beast. But, to the Viking mind, this was the point. In death, all life is equal. The blood of a man and the blood of a horse are the same currency to Odin. They were all just vessels of vitality, emptied out to keep the world turning. The smell in that grove must have been overpowering, a mix of rotting meat, iron, and pine. The sound of the chains creaking, the ropes straining, the crows feasting on the eyes of the dead. Adam mentions that during the feasting, the Vikings sang songs. He calls them incantations. He refuses to write down the lyrics. He simply says, "They were so many and so unseemly that it is better to pass over them in silence." What were they singing as they ate and drank beneath the rotting bodies of their brothers? We will never know. But we know that this ritual continued for centuries. It was the heartbeat of the old way. However, Adam of Bremen was writing from a distance. He heard stories. Some historians argued that maybe he exaggerated. Maybe it was just Christian propaganda to make the pagans look like savages. For a long time, we thought Uppsala might be a myth. But then, archaeologists started digging in the peat bogs of Denmark. And they found them. They found the men with the ropes still around their necks. They found the Bog Bodies. And suddenly, the horror of the sacred grove didn't look like propaganda anymore. It looked like a crime scene. Asterisk. Adam of Bremen wrote of men hanging in trees, swinging in the wind until they rotted. Ibn Fadlan wrote of a girl strangled with a rope. For centuries, historians looked at these texts with skepticism. They called them exaggerations. They called them Christian propaganda designed to make the pagans look like savages. After all, paper burns. Ink fades. We had no physical proof of these ritual executions until we started digging in the peat. Denmark is a land of bogs. Vast, silent wetlands where the earth is spongy and dark. For thousands of years, people have gone into these bogs to cut peat for fuel. And occasionally, the spade hits something that isn't wood. It hits something soft. Something that feels like leather. In 1950, two brothers were cutting peat near the village of Tolland. They uncovered a face. It was so fresh, so perfectly preserved, that they immediately dropped their tools and called the police. They believed they had stumbled upon a recent murder victim. They thought the killer was still loose in the area. But the police were wrong. And the brothers were wrong. The man in the mud had not died yesterday. He had died 2,000 years ago. He is known as the Tolland Man, and he is the Mona Lisa of the dead. If you look at his face today, resting in a museum in Silkeborg, it is terrifyingly human. You can see the stubble on his chin. He hadn't shaved on the day of his death. You can see the wrinkles around his eyes. He looks like he is sleeping. His expression is peaceful, almost meditative. But if you look lower, the peace ends. Around his neck, braided from leather, is a noose. The Tolland Man was not a criminal. We know this because his body was treated with extreme care. His eyes were closed. His body was arranged in a sleeping position. Criminals were usually thrown into pits or left for the wolves. This man was placed. He was a gift. Forensic analysis of his stomach contents revealed his last meal, a porridge made of seeds and grains, barley. It was a specific, ritualistic winter meal. He ate it, and then he was led to the bog and hanged. But he is not alone. The bogs of northern Europe have surrendered hundreds of bodies. And as we analyze them, a pattern of overkill emerges. This is a crucial concept in understanding Viking and Germanic sacrifice. Take the Grorbel man. He wasn't just strangled. His throat was slit from ear to ear with such force that it severed the esophagus. Other bodies show signs of the triple death. The victim is beaten, blunt force trauma, then stabbed or strangled, and finally drowned in the water. Why? Why kill a man 3 times? Because the ritual demanded it. Each form of death was likely an offering to a different god. The hanging was for Odin, the lord of the gallows. The weapon wound was for Thor. The drowning was for the Vanir, the gods of the earth and water. The chemistry of the bog is what saved them for us. The sphagnum moss releases acid that arrests the decay of flesh. It tans the skin like leather. It dyes the hair red. It dissolves the calcium in the bones, leaving the body flexible like a rubber doll, but the face remains frozen in time. These bodies are the physical receipts of the transactions described by the monks. They prove that the angel of death was not a literary invention. The rope was real. The strangulation was real. The bogs were considered liminal spaces. They were neither land nor water. They were unstable boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead. To the Viking mind, this was the perfect place to deposit a message. You didn't bury the sacrifice. You sank it. You placed it in the doorway, and the sheer number of them suggests that this wasn't a rare occurrence. In times of famine, in times of war, or perhaps just to mark the turning of the great cycles. The tribes of the north marched their chosen ones out onto the wet moss. They put the noose around their necks, and they sent them into the black water. But strangulation and drowning were relatively clean deaths. They left the body intact. There is another ritual mentioned in the sagas. A ritual so gruesome, so anatomically complex, that for 100 years, historians refused to believe it was physically possible. It was the ultimate execution for the enemies of the Vikings, a punishment reserved for kings who had insulted the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. They called it the Blood Eagle, and unlike the Bog Bodies, it didn't leave a corpse. It left a masterpiece of gore. Asterisk here is Chapter 7. This is one of the most anticipated and controversial parts of any Viking documentary. I have expanded this chapter significantly to cover not just the gory description, but the forensic analysis of whether it was actually physically possible to perform. It balances the horror of the legend with modern anatomical science. Chapter 7. The Blood Eagle Either. Bog bodies are terrifying because they are quiet. They are peaceful sleepers in the mud. But there is another ritual in the Viking repertoire that is loud, messy, and so anatomically complex that for centuries, historians simply refused to believe it was real. They argued that no human being could inflict such specific, artistic cruelty upon another. They called it a mistranslation of poetry. They called it a metaphor for birds feasting on the dead. But the sagas are very specific. They give it a name, BLRN. The Blood Eagle, it is the ultimate execution. A punishment reserved not for common thieves or cowards, but for the most hated enemies of the North. It was the vengeance of sons against the killers of their fathers. The most famous instance in history is the death of King Alella of Northumbria. According to the legend, Alella had killed the great Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of snakes. When Ragnar, Sunziva the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Uber invaded England to take revenge, they didn't just want Ella dead. They wanted him unmade. They wanted to turn him into a monument of their fury. So what exactly is the Blood Eagle? If we piece together the descriptions from the Orkneyinga saga and the tale of Ragnar's sons, we get a step-by-step manual of mutilation. The victim is restrained, face down. He is usually kneeling or prone. First, the executioner takes a knife, for perhaps a sand cuts the skin along the spine, stripping the flesh back to reveal the column of vertebrae. Then comes the bonework. Using an axe or a specialized tool, the executioner severs the ribs from the spine. Not all of them, just the ones attached to the thoracic cage. Crack, crack, crack. One by one, the bones are detached from the anchor of the back. Once the ribs are severed, they are pulled outward. They are wrenched open to the sides, like a gate swinging open. In the gory anatomy of the ritual, these spread ribs resemble the wings of a bird. The eagle is taking shape, but the ritual is not done. With the chest cavity exposed from the back, the executioner reaches inside. He bypasses the heart. He finds the lungs. He pulls the lungs out through the open wounds in the back and lays them over the spread ribs. As the victim takes his final, ragged breaths, the lungs inflate and deflate on his back. The wings of the eagle appear to flutter. For decades, scholars dismissed this. They said it was impossible. They said the victim would die from shock or blood loss within seconds of the first rib being cut, making the fluttering lung finale impossible. They argued that the Vikings didn't have the surgical knowledge to perform it. It was just a scary story to frighten the English. But recently, a team of medical doctors and historians from Kiel University decided to test the myth. They didn't use bodies, of course. They used state-of-the-art computer modeling and anatomical software usually used to train surgeons. They asked the question, is the blood eagle anatomically possible? The answer was a chilling yes. They concluded that, while it would be difficult, it was entirely within the capabilities of Viking tools. A heavy Viking spearhead, used as a chisel, could cut through the ribcage from the back. However, they also settled the debate about the suffering. The doctors concluded that no human being could survive the full process. The victim would almost certainly die from pneumothorax, collapsed lungs, or massive blood loss as soon as the chest cavity was breached. The fluttering wings part. That was likely performed on a corpse. The lungs would be pulled out after death to complete the visual symbol. So, while the magical idea of a living man enduring the whole thing might be an exaggeration, the act itself was real. It was a ritual desecration. Why go to such lengths? Why not just behead the king? Because the blood eagle wasn't just about pain. It was about Odin. Odin is the raven god. The eagle is a bird of prey, a beast of the battlefield. By turning the enemy into a bird, the Vikings were offering him up to the It was a way of erasing the enemy's humanity. King Allar was no longer a king. He was meat for the gods. He was a grotesque sculpture made of bone and breath. This ritual represents the peak of Viking brutality. It combines high-level anatomy with high-level theology. It shows us a culture that viewed the human body not as a temple, but as raw material. But rituals like the blood eagle and the angel of death didn't just happen because men were angry. They happened because they were afraid. They happened because they believed that if they didn't offer blood, the world would end. And to mediate this transaction, to ensure the blood was spilled correctly, they needed experts. They didn't trust just anyone with the knife. They trusted the women. We have talked about the warriors. Now we must talk about the witches. We must talk about cider. We have spoken of the axe and the sword. We have spoken of the physical tools of the Viking Age. But to understand why a society would willingly strangle its own children or hang its men in trees, we must look beyond the warriors. We must look at the architects of these nightmares in the saga of Eric the Red. There is a scene that describes a woman entering a hall. She is wearing a blue cloak set with stones. She wears a necklace of glass beads. On her head is a hood made of black lambskin lined with white cat fur. In her hand, she holds a staff adorned with brass and stones. When she enters, everyone stands. They do not salute her as a friend. They salute her with the terrifying reverence reserved for a messenger of the other side. She is a Volga, a seeress, a practitioner of Seer, the angel of death, who drove the dagger into the slave girl on the Volga, was not a random old woman. She was a professional. She was part of a sisterhood that held a power arguably greater than any king or jarl. The king commanded the bodies of his men, but the Volga commanded their souls. Seer, pronounced Seda, was the Old Norse form of shamanism, but it was not the magic of fireballs or lightning bolts. It was the magic of fate. The Vikings believed that destiny was not a straight line, but a tapestry. The Norns, the three goddesses of fates, at the base of the world tree, spinning, measuring, and cutting the threads of every human life. The Volga was the earthly avatar of these goddesses. She could see the threads, and, if the price was right, she could twist them. The rituals of Seer were deeply connected to the feminine arts, specifically spinning and weaving. In the Viking mind, to weave a piece of cloth was to bind fibers together. Magic was simply the act of binding minds. The Volga could spin a man's mind to make him forget his fear like the berserkers, or she could bind his heart with terror so he froze in battle. This is why the staff was her symbol. It wasn't a walking stick. It was modeled after a distaff, the tool used for holding wool while spinning. It was the tool used to control the thread of life. Archaeology backs this up. In excavations across Scandinavia, we find graves of high-status women buried with strange iron staffs. For years, museums labeled them as roasting spits for cooking meat, because the male historians couldn't accept that women held such power. But we now know they were wands. We find them buried with pouches containing henbane seeds for trance, owl pellets, and small charms. But there was a dark stigma attached to this power. In Viking society, Seer was considered a woman's domain. For a man to practice it was a taboo. It was considered Ergian, manly, perverse, and shameful. Why? Because Seer required the practitioner to enter a trance state, to be ridden by the spirits, to lose control. To a Viking man, whose entire identity was built on dominance and control, surrendering his mind to a spirit was a form of sexual and spiritual submission that was intolerable. Yet there was one exception, one terrifying paradox at the heart of their religion. Odin. Odin was the All-Father, the king of the gods, the archetype of the warrior. But he was also the master of Seer. He learned the dark arts from the goddess Freya. He sacrificed his own eye for wisdom. He hung himself from the world tree to learn the runes. Odin was a god who broke the gender rules of his own society to gain power. He showed that true mastery required understanding both the sword, the masculine, and the magic, the feminine. This is why the vulva was so feared. She walked in the footsteps of Odin. She stood on the threshold between the living and the dead. When the angel of death told the Rus Vikings that the gods required the life of a girl, they did not argue. You do not argue with the person who holds the scissors of fate. The rituals we have described, the sacrifice on the Volga, the hanging bodies at Uppsala, the blood eagle, were not chaotic acts of violence. They were engineered. They were calculated transactions brokered by these sorceresses. They monitored the weather. They watched the crops. And when the world grew dark, when the winter was too long, they consulted the bones and declared the price. The gods are hungry, they would say, and the warriors, for all their bravery, would tremble, because they knew that against a sword you can fight, but against the weaving of the vulva there is no defense. You are just a thread waiting to be cut. But this leads us to the deepest question of all. Why? Why did they believe this? What kind of psychology creates a culture where dragging a girl to a boat and stabbing her is seen as a holy necessity? To understand the why, we must look at the Viking worldview. We must look at their fear of the twilight. Asterisk, we have watched the knife enter the ribs. We have seen the bodies swinging in the sacred grove. We have analyzed the anatomy of the blood eagle. And now, the modern mind screams out a single question: why? Why would a father strangle his daughter? Why would a community watch a young girl be raped and stabbed and call it a celebration? It is easy to label them as savages, to say they were simply bloodthirsty barbarians who enjoyed pain. But that is a lazy answer, and it is wrong. The Vikings were not sadists. They were survivalists. To understand the logic of the sacrifice, you must understand the terrified landscape of the Norse mind. We live in a world where we believe the sun will rise tomorrow because of physics. Gravity spins the earth, the sun burns its fuel, and the cycle continues. The Vikings did not have that luxury. To them, the sun did not rise because of gravity. It rose because it was running away. In their mythology, the sun SL was being chased across the sky every single day by a massive wolf named Skull. If the wolf caught her, the light would die, the world would freeze, and the end would begin. This was their reality. They lived in a universe that was actively trying to kill them. Unlike Christianity, which promises an eternal paradise where good triumphs over evil, the Norse religion promised ... nothing. It promised Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The Vikings believed that their gods, Zordin, Thor, Frey, were not immortal. They were doomed. There was a date circled on the calendar of the cosmos when the walls of Asgard would fall, when the wolf Fenrir would swallow Odin whole, and when the world would burn and sink into the sea. They knew they were fighting a losing war. And when you are fighting a losing war, you do not ask for mercy. You buy time. This is the core of the blot, the sacrifice. The Latin phrase for this relationship is, "Do iute Dei, I give, so that you may give." The gods were not benevolent parents. They were dangerous, greedy warlords. They needed fuel to fight the giants. They needed armies for the final battle. So, the sacrifice wasn't murder. It was a supply run. When they hung the 9 men at Uppsala, they weren't punishing them. They were sending reinforcements to Odin. They were recharging the batteries of the divine protection that kept the frost giants away. When they burned the girl on the Volga, they were ensuring her master would arrive in the afterlife as a king, not a beggar. If he arrived weak, he couldn't fight for the clan from the other side. This fear was rooted in something very real. Historians now believe that much of this grim theology was shaped by a trauma that happened centuries before the Viking Age began. In the year 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland or North America, threw a veil of ash over the northern hemisphere. The sun was dimmed for 18 months. Crops failed. Summer never came. It is estimated that half the population of Scandinavia died of starvation and cold. They called it the Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter. The memory of that horror was burned into their DNA. They knew what it looked like when the gods turned away. They knew the cold was waiting. So, every winter, when the days got shorter and the sun hung low and weak on the horizon, the panic set in. Is this it? Is the wolf catching up? Is the sun dying again? Panic requires action. It requires a grand gesture to convince the universe to spare you for one more year. And what is the most valuable thing a human being possesses? It isn't gold. It isn't silver. It is blood. Blood is life. It is heat. It is energy. By spilling that hot red life onto the cold white snow, they believed they were feeding the earth. They were transferring the vitality of the victim into the soil, into the trees, into the gods themselves. The angel of death wasn't killing the girl out of hate. In her mind, she was saving the world. She was performing a necessary maintenance on the engine of reality. This is the terrifying tragedy of the Viking worldview. They were not monsters. They were men and women huddled in the dark, terrified of the cold, willing to do the unthinkable just to see the sun rise one more time. They were trapped in a cycle of blood, but cycles can be broken. And from the south, a new story was coming. A story of a god who did not demand the blood of men, but who offered his own blood instead. The White Christ was approaching, and the angel of death was about to face her greatest enemy. The fires of the Volga eventually burned out. The bodies in the trees of Uppsala rotted into skeletons and fell to the forest floor. The bog moss grew over the faces of the strangled men. For 1,000 years, the machine of sacrifice kept turning. Blood for sun, life for protection, fear for survival, asterisk. But in the 10th and 11th centuries, a new sound began to compete with the drums of the Volga. It was the sound of church bells. The missionaries from the south brought a strange new story to the north. They spoke of a god who was not a warlord like Odin, a god who did not demand the blood of humans to stay strong. Instead, this White Christ had offered his own blood to save humanity. To the Viking mind, this was baffling. A god who died willingly, a god of peace. It went against every instinct of their culture. But Christianity brought something the old gods could not: stability. It brought alliances with powerful European kings. It brought trade, and it brought an end to the terror of the twilight. Christianity promised that the world would not end in Ragnarok. It promised an eternal kingdom that could not be eaten by a wolf. And so, the war for the soul of the North began. It was not a peaceful transition. In the year 1087, King Ing, the elder of Sweden, a Christian convert, marched on Uppsala. He did not go to worship. He went to destroy. The golden chain was torn down. The statues of Thor, Odin, and Freya were smashed. The sacred grove, fed by centuries of human blood, was burned to the ground. The smoke that rose from Uppsala that day was the signal. The old ways were finished. The laws changed. The Gularing law code explicitly banned the blot. It stated, if any man is found sacrificing to the heathen gods, he shall be outlawed and his property confiscated. The rituals that had once been the highest duty of a chieftain were now capital crimes. And what of the angel of death? What happened to the women who wielded the dagger? The vulva fell the hardest. Under the old way, she was a queen of the spirit world, respected and feared. Under the new way, she was something else entirely. She was a witch. The church hunted them down. The staff, once a symbol of prophecy, became the broomstick of folklore. The seeress became the wicked hag. The magic of cider was branded as devil worship. The women who had once guided the kings of the north were pushed into the shadows, forced to whisper their incantations in secret, until they too faded into myth today. We look back at the Vikings and we see the glory. We see the ships exploring America. We see the beautiful carvings. We see the adventure. But we must never forget the shadow. We must never forget the girl on the Volga. We must not forget the men in the bog. They remind us of a time when humanity looked at the dark sky and felt so small, so terrified that we believed murder was the only way to turn on the lights. The Viking Age was a time of undeniable greatness, but it was also a time of magnificent cruelty. The gods of the north have gone silent. The raven no longer expects a feast. The rope remains slack, but the history is still there, buried in the mud, waiting for us to tell the truth. The angel of death is gone, but her ghost still haunts the pages of history, reminding us of what we are capable of when fear takes the wheel. This has been the Viking Saga. Thank you for watching.